Good afternoon, folks. Today I'm going to be working on carburetor stuff, the throttle linkage and the TV cable linkage. And I'm going to have to make a few parts, fabricate them to make it all fit. The cables I'm using are low-car cable kits. And I'm going to end up showing how to do that, a good way of doing that, and also how to properly set up your TV cable. These transmissions, a lot of them are burnt up from improper settings, so I think this is worthwhile for people to know. And I've also noticed a whole lot of videos where they warn you, you better set it up properly, but then they don't bother to tell you how. I'm going to show how. And I dropped the pan so you could even see, I could show the linkage that it's actually going into, and then that way you can understand why I'm saying the things that I am. I'm a little repetitive on being careful about overextending the cable, but the low-car kit eliminates the safety mechanism that the stock cable has in it, and that gives the possibility of breaking something. So I'm going to go over that, and I think people will find it interesting. Well, let's get going. Okay, this is the universal throttle cable kit that I have. It's a Summit brand. It's pretty similar to a low car, but it was a little bit cheaper. Okay, this here is the bracket that was existing on the car. I removed it. I took this apart, and what I did was I cut a cut there so I could bend this up to make it an angle. And what it is there's a vacuum port that has to go underneath here. So I'm going to weld a piece here to make it taller in this area. I'm going to cut that out to clearance it, and then that way this will fit over where the carburetor is, and it has the vacuum port there. Okay, here's the part. I welded on a piece, and then I bent it to give it a little bit more strength, but this will give it some clearance for that vacuum line. And then once it's painted up, it shouldn't look too bad. So next step is to test fit it onto the carburetor. Okay, here's the piece on here now. It fits, it clears this hole, this hose, and we got it bolted on. Now I'm going to put on the second piece and keep going from there. Okay, now I have this other piece on that I can stick the throttle cable into. So this here goes in like that. One-handed, it's especially fun to do, but that's the way that goes in, and it'll hook on there somewhere. And this of course is not the cable I'm going to use. This one here is pretty beat up, but I'm going to install that new one like that, and then the next step will be the kick-down cable. Throttle cables. This one here, the aftermarket one, is much longer than the original, so it's going to have to be cut to length. This here is the plastic adapter, the retaining clip, I guess you would call it, that goes on the gas pedal. So this end here will need to be removed because the clip goes right on that end there. And this is going to have to be shortened because, as you can see, the original cable is much different in length. So what I've found, because this stuff likes to unravel, this piece slides back. So what you do is you take the inner cable out, you slide this back till you get to the length that you're looking for, and then you cut this without ever taking this off. Because the way that likes to unravel, it'll drive you insane trying to put that back on. That's just the tip of the day. Okay, here's the cable. It's in here. It's hooked to this. There's just enough slack so we know it's not gonna, the pedal's not gonna cause the throttle to stay on. Down here, I had to drill another hole because the cable wasn't going straight into the pedal very well, and this one isn't perfectly straight, but it's better than it was. But this is on here, this adjustment here. So I've checked it, and it gets full throttle. The pedal actually doesn't quite touch the floor, so I'm going to have to wait until I have my carpet in to see how much space, if I have to put a block in there to keep it from overstressing this. Okay, here's the cable installed here. This is where I'm about 3/4 inch lower. I could put the cable back up here if I wanted to, but as you see, as it pulls it, it's actually pretty straight. You could tell from this, it's not touching the floor, so I'm going to have to watch out for that. There aren't any other choices on the carburetor without drilling holes and messing with it, so my solution is going to be to put the carpet in, see how much I have to put here to keep it from stressing the cable. But we have idle and we have full throttle. Okay, in this section I'm going to explain how you set the TV cable on this thing. So this car, I put a low car kit on it. As you can see, it's aftermarket. It doesn't have that slip joint that the factory one has, so you got to be a little bit careful, because that slip joint is designed to protect the transmission from breaking the linkage inside the transmission. I'll show that later. But the first step here is you set this to full throttle. As you can see, I got a brick on the throttle and that's holding it down. And so now I got to set this. And as you can see, you can pull it a certain amount. And you want tension on it, but you don't want so much tension that you're damaging the linkage inside. So it takes a little practice. And there's two parts to the setting. One is full throttle, and the other part of the setting is part throttle. And they're not the same. So this here, which will adjust the cable forward and backward, this is to set the full throttle tension. Okay, now if you find that full throttle works but it slips at part throttle, assuming the transmission is good, you have to move the pivot point here, meaning this is the pivot point where the axle through the carburetor goes. Okay, and this distance is what affects the part throttle. So if this hole that came from the factory for Metalbrock is wrong, I'll have to drill another hole to move where the pivot point is. And generally speaking, if you need more holding power at part throttle, the hole has to get closer to the pivot point of the shaft, and so you'd have to drill a hole probably about right there. Okay, I'm not going to do that yet because I'm not ready to test drive the car to see if I need to, but that's a pointer. Remember, if it holds full throttle but not part throttle, this adjuster isn't going to help you. Okay, so what I've done is now the throttle is returned so I can work this easier. You can see it's hard to see, there's a black mark there where I marked it with a marker. So I'm putting that there. I'm going to tighten it, and that'll be correct for full throttle. And then obviously, as I said earlier, part throttle we'll find out. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate this as it's adjusted, and I'll show you why possibly you have to move the pivot point. As you can see, there's quite a bit of slop here. All right, but you get on the throttle, you get after it. See, there's not a lot more you can pull it. So that's set for full throttle, but part throttle, it's not coming out until you're pretty far into the throttle. Now that might be fine with a normally aspirated engine like this one. When I had that transmission behind a supercharged engine, of course, at a quarter throttle, it was making a ton of torque and it would slip. So I had to move my pivot point up so that this was pulling out almost immediately right off of idle. So you have to experiment with that, and depending on how much torque your engine is making. But don't assume the transmission is a piece of crap because you just doubled your torque and it slips now. Just mess with this. Just remember, this is for full throttle setting, and these pivot points are for your part throttle settings. Okay, I decided to change my pivot point here. I thought about it and I said, you know, I'm just going to do it. There's a couple things to think about. As you can see here, I moved it up so it's closer to this, but I moved it forward a little bit because this adjustment screw for the fast idle, I didn't want to get into that, so I didn't want to go straight above it. But I think this will work okay, and now I'm going to piece it together and I'm going to show you how it changes things. Okay, here it is put back together. I angled this back a little bit because that is a bit low, but it'll work. But what you see here is we're at full throttle, and that I didn't make any more adjustments to this, so I got to move this back or adjust that back, one or the other, and then it'll be correct. But this is the point that it's making, is that moving this closer to the pivot reduces the stroke. But what happens when we put it back to 0 throttle? Okay, here we are at 0 throttle and we have this much slack. And so because we know that we can take up some slack, we can cut the slack in half, like it's like that. That way when you're tipping into the throttle, you're starting to get into the TV cable's function a little bit earlier, which is to raise your line pressure and give you more holding power in second gear. So since I've already tightened that down and I have adjustment, I'm going to use this one to adjust it back. Alright, I've adjusted this a little bit, so then I can tighten up on this. As you can see, there's a little bit less slack there. I could probably tighten it a little more. But at this point, I'm going to stop adjusting without road testing. I just wanted to demonstrate where you move, how you move the pivot point to reduce the stroke, so that way you're at a higher starting point for off idle, and that'll help your part throttle holding power. And you still have to adjust this so that it's fully extended on full throttle, so you have maximum holding power at full throttle. So that's it. That's how you do it. Okay, up in here is where the TV cable kit goes into the transmission. You can see my finger there. It's hard to tell because I'm not taking the header off, just to show that. That's where it goes in the transmission. And now I've dropped the pan to show what it's actually actuating. And this is going to be difficult, but so this here is what it's actually working on. And it's hard to see. It's basically impossible without me taking the thing apart, but it's hooked to this thing through a little clip. And if you overextend it, you could pop things apart in here. That's why it's important to, when you're using an aftermarket cable without a release mechanism, that you don't overextend it when you're setting your full throttle. And so there it is.